Hello and welcome back to another standard game in the old Emo Dave YouTube channel. My name is John, this is my partner Jay, and Jay, what are we watching today?
We're watching some standard. What's not to love? On the left we have Dan, on the right we have Scott.
Yeah.
And it's Dimir Midrange versus Squirming Reanimator.
So Squirming Reanimator is using sort of the key card called Squirming Reemergence. It's a 3 mana, 1 colorless, 1 green, 1 black card that allows you to get a permanent. I think it's like enchantment or creature or something.
It's a non-land permanent card from your graveyard with mana value less than or equal to the number of permanent cards in your graveyard.
Yes. And it allows you to sort of like have a play style where you can like just dump big creatures into the yard or a big enchantment into the yard, as we may see.
Yeah,
and
it is the cheapest reanimator that can hit anything given the right circumstances. You know, that usually reanimators are 5 mana, I would say. But this one 3, and if you can mill enough permanents, which I'm sure this deck will be able to do, you know, you can mill you have enough permanents to be able to get back anything.
And we do see one of them now, the Falaji so-and-so. So what's great here is that Emergence is a sorcery spell. If you mill it with Falahi, you do end up with the ability to get it back to your hand. So it does sort of save you in a way to combo whilst proceeding your plan to mill yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the Archaeologist is everything you want. You get to mill some stuff. You get to put a card into your hand. It looked like it was a Well of the Forgotten, another card that uses Descent Well. And wow, we see an Otherworldly Gaze that straight up puts Atraxa in there. So as soon as Scott has 7 permanents in his graveyard.
Yeah, CMC equals 7. So what's important here is that it's not, you can't just use the card you put in there as the way to make the value. Every other card in the graveyard has to equal 7.
So we see a Steam Core Scholar from both sides.
So Steam Core Scholar is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it looked really good for Dan. Draw 2 cards, discard 2 lands. Dan looks really flooded, so the looting will help a lot. But right now, it looks like Dan is not interacting with what Scott's doing, and Scott is really close to getting a huge Atraxa out there.
Oh, but the bat comes down maybe just in time here.
But there are 2 Squirming Emergence in Scott's hand.
I mean, maybe take the Titan?
So Dan can't take both Titan, but why would you take Titan? Scott's not going to cast it anyway.
No. Oh, he takes the Whale of the Forgotten. I guess it's just a way to stop Scott from filling its graveyard further at this point.
Also, it stops Scott from just immediately bouncing the bat anyway.
That is true.
You're sort of locked in with the bat to exile a removal. So I'm quite surprised by an Infernal Grasp being used there, when you know that Atraxa might be coming back next turn.
Yeah, it's an interesting decision because he's seen both emergences. Maybe they both counted the graveyard and thought, oh well, there's not enough in the graveyard to.
It looks like there's enough in the graveyard now with the Otherworldly Gaze and put a land back on top. So here's Atraxa. I think this is just going to be a game. Wow,
So Atraxa is just one of those other cards that, when it comes down, it just feels unstoppable, especially in standard. Like,
I mean, you draw like 4 or 5 cards, and you have this huge, unbeatable creature unless you can remove it. And against a reanimator deck, it doesn't matter if you remove it. You know, Dan can kill it next time, and then Scott will say, "All right, I'll use a Squirming Emergence on it again."
Yeah, literally, and like. The only way Dan might have been able to sort of outmaneuver this is that he had some sort of pressure, but there didn't seem to be much in the way of pressure sort of early.
Yeah,
and so
I feel like maybe this is a case of why did Dan keep the hand? Nothing until turn 3 feels a bit sus. I mean, if Dan was able to go, let's say, bat on turn 2, another bat on turn 3, then they might have had a chance, or a Tidebinder, or or some other form of interaction.
I think one thing that we might have to consider, this is game one. So, this is Dan. Dan might not have seen this coming. The hand he kept might have been good in 80% of the matchups that it could go against.
True. We do have to remember it is game one. Here we see a Whale of the Forgotten on the Shieldred.
I mean, at this stage, right, So, I think Scott is kind of recognizing that Shieldred could get out of hand, so he's trying to sort of keep Dan effectively tapped out. If Dan wants to replay Shieldred, he is committing the majority of his mana to that play every time. And in the meantime, you just have a giant Atraxa smacking in the air for 7, and Dan is not blocking with either of his flying blockers that he's not attacking with anyway.
And here we see a Squirming Emergence again, bringing back another creature. Bringing back the Virtue of Persistence,
which is basically another reanimation spell. Oh dear.
I wonder how much Graveyard Hate Dan has in his sideboard and whether it will be enough.
I don't know how often, in Standard there's the Hearse. What other Graveyard Hate?
I think the reason why at the last Pro Tour we didn't see that much Dimir midrange, but we saw a lot of Esper, is Rest in Peace.
Yeah.
Rest in Peace is just so good against any Reanimator style deck that it's worth playing an extra color for, and then you get to play like Rafine and a couple other white cards.
Yeah. I think Esper midrange is a very popular archetype, and it's interesting to see sort of what the version without the white color can do in this position, but I thought they just scooped then. So I think Scott's been able to just remove the board, free reign for Atraxa to just keep going in.
Yeah,
I believe the mid range should be at 2.
You have to admire Dan for continuing to play on through this.
Well, we do see another interesting card. There's a new card from Thunder Junction in the graveyard. It's a giant serpent thing.
I believe it's a worm.
Yes.
And it gets flash if you control a desert. And we did see that Scott did have a desert or two. So I think this is like a backup plan.
Yeah.
So if the opponent has interaction or some sort of way to stop your graveyard, you then get to say, hey, I have a 6/5 flash trample worm, and it's just going to kill you.
Yeah. So sideboard now. Now we are saying that Dan may need to look into potentially having Graveyard Hate on his side, but another avenue he could walk down is simply having counter magic available just to stop Squirming Emergence.
Yeah, I agree. Negate, something like that. Bring in some counter magic. Bring in some Graveyard Hate. I do say that Dan has to be fast. Because even if Dan stops a graveyard, has 10 negates in his hand for all the reanimation spells, Scott can just play a land every turn and then just play Atraxa for 7 mana.
Yeah.
If he has the right colours.
Yeah,
well, can play a Titan of Industry.
Yeah, at least a Titan of Industry, right? Or maybe even that Snake. I think one of the things we gotta that's really important here as well is that we didn't see much removal from Scott. There was like one card sort of acting as removal, and then Scott was winning on purely the value of the creature that he had on board.
It looks like Scott did bring in a Duress this game, which is pretty good. You expect your blue opponent to bring in counter spells, and Duress, checks if the coast is clear. So here we see a bat. 2 Squirming Emergences in hand again. Personally, I would take the Founding just because it's the only thing that sets Scott up. It mills some cards.
Oh,
but choosing to take the Duress instead.
He's thinking that there's a card in hand that's very important.
Yeah, that must be what it is. I wonder what he has in hand, a non-creature spell that he really doesn't want Duress taking.
And we do see a Titan of Industry in the yard and the Virtue of Persistence as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be a Founding with no value apart from 2 mana mill 4, which is definitely feels bad.
Ooh.
And we do see a hearse. Now, hearse is something that Duress could have taken, so maybe this was the game plan. Bat the Duress, then get a hearse down, take the 2 creatures. And I mean, Scott has nothing in hand, right? This founding is a piece of blank text that's going to go to the graveyard.
Yeah. And this just allows kind of...
Squirming Emergence on a founding. That is some big brain play. I didn't even consider that.
I think it's kind of... So Scott doesn't... It doesn't look like Scott has any other sort of sources of sort of mill in his hand. So he's just trying to keep the clock going as much as possible.
I mean, it is one of the weaknesses of Unlicensed Hearse is it doesn't actually chew down the graveyard that fast. So it is possible to... sort of outrace the hearse and get enough permanents into the graveyard. Although I guess at this point, Dan can forever, hold up hearse to exile whatever the emergence targets.
Yeah. We do see a Otawara, which can be potentially an answer to the hearse if Scott wants to force that out.
We see Bonnie Pal in hand as well, which is a very good card and very against graveyard hate. So if Scott can survive until 6 lands, they could potentially be playing that. Yeah.
I mean, Dan has it a bit on lock, so he's developed a bit of a board. He has the Ledger Shredder that can grow every turn. Scott targeting... Oh, so this is the uncounterable removal, but he's targeting it. And he's not choosing to cast it, so it's going to stay exiled. So the thing with the chapter is once you pick the spell, that it has to be exiled.
It's exiled by Unlicensed Hearse.
Oh, by Unlicensed Hearse?
Yes.
Oh, he responded to it.
Yeah, Dan kept it up and so exiled the Worm and the Long Goodbye. So Scott wasn't able to get any value.
Oh, I didn't see that. Oh, and then we see Duress number 2. And what is in Dan's hand? Both creatures. Ooh, that is not a good Duress.
Oh, sorry. Actually, it looked like Dan in response. Sorry. All right, that's game anyway. But it looks like Scott in response used the Worm graveyard ability to search the library for a desert because Scott was really in need of some lands there. I mean, this is what could have happened game 1. Dan had loads of interaction, a lot of early pressure, and Scott just wasn't able to execute his game plan.
No, and I think obviously that hearse did a lot to sort of like keep Scott off the game plan slightly, right? Like by not being able to deal with the hearse, it just meant that Scott needed to mill multiple copies of decent targets, or eventually, hopefully, being able to play the creature in his hand at the time. But he also just didn't draw the lands. It
was perfect from Dan. Dan took Scott's interaction. Dan had graveyard hate, and then Dan had pressure and a lot of pressure. Yeah. And so it was exactly what Dan wants. Bet you Scott is hoping that he's able to get on the board a bit quicker this time. So Otherworldly Gaze we see cast.
It's pretty good here. So he's able to sort of sculpt his draw a bit here by doing it at the beginning of his upkeep. So he's able to draw, and I think he needed that land off the top. Oh, and a negate and Prof's Edict Memory. And he gets rid of the Edict Memory. So what we're seeing here, this version of the Midrange deck uses that spell as kind of its engine. So it makes a lot more sense now. A lot of the creatures are quite small, but they benefit from getting +1/+1 counters.
Yep. I mean, Evangel of Synthesis is a very good card with the proofs. They really need to make cards more pronounceable. I don't know how to pronounce the prophets.
Something.
I don't know.
The Proft enchantment.
So here we see an archaeologist putting more things into the graveyard. It doesn't look like there's any permanents apart from, well, there's a founding and a land.
But we did see that Scott did pick up a Long Goodbye from the archaeologist, so that the advisory bird may be going down, and we do see another Proft enchantment, and kind of seeing it go to work a little bit already. So every time you would draw an extra card, This includes when it itself is being played, it loots. Every time you draw an extra card, you can put a +1/+1 counter equal to the amount of extra cards drawn on target creature. Cards like the Bat with lifelink and flying. Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, Ledger Shredder just gets double counters, really, when you connive.
Yeah, double counters when you connive and discard a non-land card. But so, there's also...
interestingly here, it looks like Scott is going for his own game plan. So not using the whale to bounce the Shredder and not using the Long Goodbye. I think Scott is concerned about his own game plan and thinks, if I can reanimate this Titan, I can get back into this game. And so I think that's what Scott is going for here. I think he's burning through cards. He knows he's got to be quick before there's Graveyard Hate or counter spells up. And a Titan of Industry, it gets him back in the game by a big way.
It does. But one thing to keep in mind is we know this is Squirming Emergence. Is there just not enough CMC in the graveyard for Scott?
There is enough permanence in the graveyard. There will be.
Okay, so I don't know if Scott is probably... What is Scott looking for? He's quite desperately looking for something here.
3. Actually, I could be wrong. Maybe there wasn't enough. Scott definitely did dig a lot.
Yeah.
Has a desert to come into play.
Yeah.
King for 1. So we're not going to see a Squirming Emergence this turn. It doesn't look like Scott's got one in his hand. It looks like Scott just has an Atraxa.
And Long Goodbye to deal with the Shouldred. Now, Shouldred is probably just going to be blocked by the Falaji.
Yeah, Long Goodbye to deal with the Bird Advisor.
And we do know Dan has Negate in hand. Now, if he decides to keep that open, that's only going to effectively prevent Scott, unless he has a duress effect, from being able to cast Squirming Emergence safely in this position.
Yeah, I mean, this is the engine of this deck. Playing Evangelist Synthesis, getting to draw a card, discard a card, and put a counter on Shieldred, and gain 2 life from Shieldred. Whole lot of value there.
Yeah. Oh, and we do see a Virtual Persistence to deal with another creature, gaining 2 life. So he's trying to thin the board, but Shouldred is sticking around and...
Yeah, I mean, Scott is trying to buy time until he can cast a Squirming Emergence. But, I mean, this time is running out. Shieldred hits very hard. It's going to be 5 damage this turn, plus 2 from the drain. That would take Scott down to 7 and be on a 1. You know, this is a 2-turn block unless Scott can do something.
Oh, and Dan is able to draw another card, I believe, off this one.
Yeah,
a few more cards.
You draw 2, I believe, of the Scholar. So I think that's 2 more counters, or is the Prof's enchantment only once per turn?
Yes, when it comes down. So we're going to see 2 more counters, probably on Shouldred, making that one bigger. We are seeing also, because he drew 2 cards, Shouldred will trigger twice, which will gain him 4 life. It's pretty good.
It is pretty good. I do like that this, we've sort of seen what this deck is about. I feel like game 1, we didn't get to see it. Game 2, we saw sort of a Dimir mid-range. Game 3, we're seeing that this is a draw deck. You want to draw cards, and it's all built around the synergy, and it's awesome.
Yeah. Now, Scott just playing it through, and he's showing he's got the second copy. That's what he needed to do. He needed to have 2 copies in hand, and he's able to destroy the enchantment, and I believe he is making the token buddy.
That's a 4/4 Rhino.
What's important here is we are aware that in Scott's hand there is a go for the throat, so he can deal with the Titan of Industry.
Yeah, I mean, go for the throat on the Titan. I mean, there's no way around it, really. I mean, you can't afford a shield counter on the Titan.
Yeah.
And Shieldred is too big anyway. Shieldred's a 7/8, which is bigger than the Titan.
It is, but it just means that Scott can't double block. I mean, unless he plays around it by attacking with Shieldred and forcing Scott to double block.
Yeah, I mean, that does kill both creatures with the Shieldred, but I think he's going to attack like this. Force the chump. Scott goes down to really, really low life, and I don't think Scott can get back into this.
No, Scott down to 3. Dan at 32 life. I mean, if there is another Squirming Emergence, maybe.
No, I mean, the other Titan coming back wouldn't be that good. His shoulder's bigger than it now, so best it would do is chump. And then there's the Steamwork Scholar in the air and another creature with Menace.
Not necessarily, because he plays that, goes straight to the last chapter, and casts Squirming Emergence from exile.
I still think this is game, right? I guess the Rhino can chump Shieldred. The Evangels of Synthesis can get in, and then the Scholar can be blocked by the Titan. All right, maybe this isn't game. Maybe Scott's still got some gas left in him.
Yeah. Oh, we do see a Gix. So Dan will be able to draw an extra card off this, potentially, because no matter how the blocks work, right?
Yeah, and that will give Evangel of Synthesis Menace. And +1/+0 becoming a 3/3. Oh, and we see a bat.
Oh, and in response, Scott's filling his graveyard in response, and it's an Atraxa. Okay. Dan's choosing not to attack.
I mean, Dan can just wait 3 turns. Shieldred will get there in the end. It just depends how scared Dan is.
And he attacks in. What is it? What do you think this is kind of signaling? I didn't get to see what's in Scott's hand there.
That Scott is giving up.
No, that is a board wipe.
Yes, it is. Can't remember what it's called, but it wipes based on the amount of permanents in your graveyard. -X. And wow, here we see Dan really punished for not trying to push more damage through and go for the win and trying to be patient.
Yeah. I think there's a part, like, Dan might have been able, like, he had some free blocks as well, right? There was no reason for Dan not to block.
I think Dan didn't realize that there was a possibility of a sweeper, and maybe Dan would have held the Gix in his hand or the Deep Cavern Bat.
Yeah.
But it looks like Dan's found the first bit of action. Will Scott be able to find something?
We are seeing a bit of a corner turn here, though, by Scott. And main hardcast Atraxa.
Wow. After I wrote Scott out of the game, this is really embarrassing for me. That sweeper was well timed. And I mean, I think this shows a real strength of Scott's deck, is how many cards he gets to look at with the Foundings and the Otherworldly Gazes.
There was definitely some key moments there. The ability for Scott to be able to reanimate a creature again through the enchantment. The ability then to just eventually draw the card he needed to basically stay in this game.
Yeah, and now Atraxa's going to get him up to a life total where he can't lose. Especially because if Scott wants to, he can just play another Atraxa to draw 4 cards.
But back to 11, like not so long ago, Scott was on 1 life here, and another board wipe.
Because Squirming Emergence can bring Atraxa back, I believe they're choosing Bonnie Pool instead. It's a faster clock.
Get you a bigger creature.
Yeah, I believe it's a 1-turn clock with Dan's life total. I could be wrong.
Yeah. The creature itself, I believe, is equal to the number of lands?
Yeah, so that would be 8 + 6, so that's 14. Okay, so not quite lethal, but very close.
And, well, I believe Scott wins this turn.
Yeah, and there was a scoop.
Yeah. Right, well, good job to Scott with that one.